You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record. I'm returning to the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse to watch Keith Raniere's sentencing with a bit of a feeling of dread. From Keith Raniere's arrest in March of 2018 to his trial and conviction in the spring of 2019, I've been there to watch each hearing of he and his co-defendants and much of his trial. And I don't find Raniere interesting and unconventional, as he likes to describe himself. Raniere also likes to call himself controversial, but I would agree in only the same way Larry Nassar or Harvey Weinstein could be called controversial. Only controversial in how these narcissist predators were able to obtain status and power. Controversial because now they have lost their power and have been exposed for what they were all along, a dangerous criminal. The Vanguard sentencing this morning feels like a fait accompli. Convicted by a jury on all counts, on serious charges that included sexual exploitation of a child, possession of child pornography, sex trafficking conspiracy, and forced labor conspiracy, wire fraud, and conspiracy to alter records for use in a criminal proceeding. It seems certain that he will receive no less than a life sentence. Even Raniere and his devotees are waking up to the reality that their vanguard has slim chances of ever living as a free man. Raniere and his minions started a media campaign to paint Raniere as a victim of prosecutorial misconduct and an unfair trial. Two NXIVM loyalists, Michelle Hatchett and Nikki Klein, are claiming in sworn affidavits that they wanted to testify on Raniere's behalf, but were silenced by the prosecution with threats of federal charges for their own crimes. The man who famously said, quote, "There are no victims," unquote, is claiming he is a victim of ambitious, lawless prosecutors who robbed him of a defense. Raniere and his well-moneyed lawyers never raised concerns about his potential witnesses at his trial. Millions of Claire Bronfman's money was spent on Raniere's defense, yet Raniere chose not to take the stand in his own defense. No one took the stand to support Raniere because his team chose not to put on a defense. Raniere did write a lot of post-it notes, however, to his legal team. I say this to point out that Raniere was clearly in control of his own legal strategy. If he wanted to have Nikki Klein or Michelle Hatchett testify, he could have, but he didn't because it would have opened them up to a brutal cross-examination that they surely would have folded under. Which brings me back to my feelings of dread. I'm just tired of hearing about Raniere, his violated rights, and his feelings. I'm not interested in listening to his recorded jailhouse ramblings about our unfair legal system, and I'm not looking forward to listening to Keith Raniere's lawyer, Mark Agnofello, plea for a lesser sentence on account of Raniere's good work and noble intentions. I'm predicting that will be his rap right now. Raniere is the center of the NXIVM story, but he's the least interesting person in it. He's a model of mediocrity, a true sadist, sociopath, who hid behind his imposter persona of sympathetic genius. And when you get to the core of Raniere, he's just an empty, ice-cold, self-interested pedophile with a penchant for word salad and a talent for faking sincerity. So why am I going? I need a feeling of completion, and I need to see Raniere's victims, some of whom's horrific stories of abuse will stay with me forever. I need to see them get justice. I arrived at the courthouse 3.5 hours early for Raniere's sentencing to discover his cult loyalists had beat me for early places in line. DOS masters Michelle Hatchett and Nikki Klein were there dressed in black. Hatchett capped off her outfit with a large black hat that dwarfed her emaciated frame. The Society of Protectors, or the NXIVM men, were represented by Eduardo Alonso, Jim Del Negro, Mark Elliott, and his brother Justin. They had prepared well with backpacks filled with apples, bottled waters, and sandwiches, which they shared amongst themselves. Their demeanor was not sad or somber. You wouldn't know that this was a cult about to watch their leader be sentenced to life in prison. It looked exactly like a class trip of graduate students to an art museum, in best dress and on good behavior. I overheard Alonso eagerly discussing Raniere's legal strategy, saying, "Mark agrees," meaning Mark Agnofello, Raniere's lawyer, "not to bring it up so we can save it for appeal." He was clearly referring to the explosive new evidence, quote unquote, of the child pornography pictures having a time stamp off by 2 hours. This was announced at a NXIVM press conference the day before the sentencing in front of the courthouse, when one of the few journalists attending asked why the government would want to change the timestamp by hours, not years, to make the victim even younger. The NXIVM 5 looked dumbfounded until one of them mumbled something about Keith Raniere right to due process being violated. Due to COVID, the courtroom was reserved for the victims giving impact statements and elite members of the press. The rest of us watched the proceedings in one of the 6 overflow rooms. Aside from a few members of the press like Sarah Berman of Vice Canada, whose book on NXIVM titled "Don't Call It a Cult" is due out in bookstore shelves April 20th of next year, my overflow room was entirely filled with NXIVM devotees. The proceedings began with Judge Garifas reviewing the probation department's pre-sentencing report. The probation department calculated his offense level at 52. Judge Garifas calculated his offense level at 49, which seemed like a tiny win for the defense until Garifas went on to explain that a 49 also carried with it a recommended sentence of life. This was not going to be a good day for Raniere. The proceeding began with 15 victim impact statements. Camilla, who was groomed at age 13 and sexually abused by Raniere at age 15, opened up her victim impact statement with a bombshell. She had wanted to speak at Raniere's trial, but she was given a lawyer paid by Claire Bronfman's $13.8 million NXIVM legal fund. This lawyer had advised her not to testify, a strategy that benefited Raniere. Camilla went on to say that Raniere had, quote, had tried to replace her voice with his own. He shaped my being into his liking. All mine, he said, unquote. She still found it difficult to distinguish which parts of her were Raniere and which parts were her own. Raniere cut her off from her family and friends, saying, quote, he cut me off from everyone who could help me, unquote. Camilla talked about what would be a theme with other victims, Raniere's fixation on her weight. At 5 feet 5 inches tall, Raniere demanded her weight be no more than 100 pounds. And when she felt like she was losing her mind and needed medical care, Raniere told her to lose the weight first and then he would get her help. He never did. Camilla's mental health deteriorated so severely that she attempted to take her own life. Raniere told her, quote, do you know how bad it would be for me if you killed yourself? So wise, so compassionate, the great vanguard. Sarah Edmondson spoke briefly by video, calling Raniere a liar, a parasite, and a grifter who created a curriculum that taught responsibility, but while Raniere took none himself. Mark Vicente also submitted a video statement. Vicente remarked on Raniere's moral crimes. Raniere, quote, intended to cause maximum damage. You broke goodness. I do not know how to repair it. My trauma, my desolation of my psyche is your greatest joy, unquote. India Oxenberg spoke in person and with great poise. Only a small tremor in her voice betrayed the emotion under her words. Quote, you robbed me of 7 years of my life I'll never get back. You used to rub your fingers across my brand and smile. You are a sex predator, you are cruel, and you are racist, unquote. Remarking on how Raniere referred to Michelle Hatchett as the, quote, N-word, unquote, I glanced across the courtroom to catch a glance of Hatchett. She and Nikki Klein wrote steadily in their notebook, poker-faced. The weirdness of being in the same room with NXIVM loyalists cannot be understated. While the few non-NXIVM members in the room gritted our teeth, grimaced with sorrow, and occasionally wiped tears from our eyes while listening to the anguish of each of Raniere's survivors, the NXIVM members sat wide-eyed and glassy-eyed as if they were watching an episode of Friends with the sound off. Even when victims spoke directly about them, calling them minions and flying monkeys, the faces of Team NXIVM remained blank, without the slightest frown or even subtle furrow of eyebrows. Stanley Zareff, a friend of India and Catherine Oxenberg's, as well as Tony Natale's, who had been in the same overflow room, remarked on their detached demeanor over coffee at the lunch break. Quote, it's so weird, he said. Quote, the lights are on, but no one's home, unquote. The most dramatic and satisfying moment came when Mark Agnafello spoke on Raniere's behalf, asking the court for a 15-year sentence. As I predicted, Agnafello spoke about how Raniere built a community that benefited people and did much good. Then he launched into how the victims who spoke were all wrestling with feelings of betrayal, going into an old dictionary definition of the word betrayal. No one said he was mean to me at the time. No one said he was abusing me then. Everyone is waiting for Keith Raniere to say it. I had bad intent. He won't say it because he doesn't believe he had bad intent, unquote. Judge Garifas cut him off, clearly annoyed. Quote, I'm not sentencing him on his behavior, and I'm paraphrasing here. I'm sentencing him on his actions because a jury determined he broke the law. Quote, we aren't here to discuss what he felt. I'm wondering how Cammie fits into your theory of intent. What's the intent of a 45-year-old man grooming a 13-year-old girl, unquote. Agnafello was then pressed by Judge Garifas about Camilla's claims that she was given the name of a lawyer by Agnafello, paid for by Claire Bronfman, who advised her not to testify. Agnafello said he gave Camilla the name of 3 lawyers, and that she didn't like 2, but she liked 1, adding what I perceived as an admission in the negative. Quote, I didn't do the wrong thing, he said. Agnafello, now robbed of his prepared speech about Raniere's good intentions, had to improvise and pull up Vanguard's noble actions. He came up with 2. He cured Mark Elliott's Tourette's, and he created NXIVM's Mexican Peace Initiative. Without his written statements, Agnafello's statements moved into truly bizarre territory. Agnafello blamed all the punishing and frivolous lawsuits that NXIVM inflicted on its enemies as regrettable. Looking back, he thinks NXIVM was an organization desperately in need of, quote, adult lawyer supervision, unquote, as if NXIVM had just mistakenly filed all those frivolous lawsuits with the lawyer equivalent of Doogie Howser, M.D. Agnafello then quoted Tony Natale's victim impact statement that detailed Raniere's stalking after she broke up with him. Quote, even Tony Natale says he doesn't know how to leave people. He didn't intend on hurting anyone, quote unquote, Agnafello said. Judge Garifas interjected once again. Didn't intend on hurting anyone? The jury disagrees. Get to your point. Agnafello said his client should be given a more lenient sentence because he was 60 years old and this was his first arrest. I guess that's all he could come up with. The prosecution spoke briefly and to the point, and said it's outrageous for Mr. Agnefello to suggest that Keith Raniere didn't think he was hurting a child or that he could just leave women. He was 45 when he started sexually abusing Cammie when she was 15. He was 49 when he confined Cammie's sister Daniela to a room for 2 years. He was 55 when he started DOS, referring to NXIVM's secret sorority of women who made women slaves and masters and branded them with Keith Raniere's initials. Keith Raniere then spoke to the court. I do believe I'm innocent of these charges. I do believe all these people are lying. Then in a move clearly demonstrating his superior intellect, he added he was, quote, deeply remorseful for the pain he had caused, unquote. The pain he caused the people he just referred to as liars. Then adding the judge shouldn't punish other NXIVM defendants because everything was his fault. But he's innocent, right? It was an epic fail of a statement. The judge sentenced Keith Raniere to 120 years in prison. As a provision of his sentence, he is to have no contact, no visit, emails, or phone calls with anyone affiliated with NXIVM for the remainder of his life. That may be the greatest punishment of all. I left Keith Raniere's sentencing exhausted and inspired. It left me wondering if Raniere targeted his victims because they possessed the qualities he lacked: creativity, compassion, and courage. The best Raniere's defense could come up with was to call those that testified him liars. Nicole, a DOS victim who testified at Raniere's trial, summed it up best. Quote, enough of you attacking my credibility. Leave me, Danny, and the others that testified against you alone. You can't imagine the courage that it takes to testify because you don't possess it, unquote. Even the most dangerous and diabolical cannot rob us of our strength. And Mark Vicente, if goodness can be broken, it can also be mended and healed. Your testimony and that of the brave survivors of Raniere is testament to that.